Seeing himself as a direct representative of the people, especially those who elected him, Jackson sought to reward his followers by making hundreds of appointments to federal jobs and replacing those who had been carrying out those tasks for years, decades even before. Under this new policy, Jackson filled these jobs with hundreds of people who had little to no government experience, but did have a great deal of loyalty to him. Known as the spoils system, as in to the victor go the spoils, this practice in Jacksonian democracy is still widely used today, as presidents often reward those who donated richly to their candidacy, or encouraged others to do so, with lucrative positions in the Oval Office, as diplomats, or even within their own cabinets. One of Jackson's most daunting challenges came from, of all people, his vice president, John C. Calhoun from South Carolina. Since the mid-18-teens, Congress had steadily raised the tariff, the tax, that is, on imported European goods in an effort to encourage more Americans to buy American-made products. Unfortunately for Southerners, the North was the center of American manufacturing, and Northern goods were often more expensive to buy than European products. The increased tariff, by the time Jackson was elected in 1828, caused a lot of resentment in the South, as they felt that the tariff only made the North rich off of Southern money. The rift between the slave-owning South and the manufacturing North was only growing wider. Vice President John C. Calhoun despised this tariff and wished to free his fellow South Carolinians from it. Borrowing a page from what Jefferson and James Madison had established nearly 30 years earlier in the form of the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, he claimed that states still had more sovereignty than the national government and could therefore nullify or void any act of Congress that they felt was unconstitutional. By 1832, Congress, which had a slightly northern edge, raised the tariff again. Incensed, Calhoun declared the tax null and void. South Carolina would refuse to comply and threaten to secede or withdraw from the Union if any federal agents tried to collect the tax. Enraged by this threat to the Union, Jackson threatened to march the U.S. Army into South Carolina and force the state to pay the tax at gunpoint. Violence seemed inevitable until Calhoun relented and agreed to a 10-year plan that would gradually reduce the tax. While it may seem odd to think of Andrew Jackson, a Southerner, as an advocate for the power of the national government, one must not forget that he fought and nearly died for the establishment of an independent nation, one he would not willingly live to see torn asunder. Jackson would, however, side with his Southern brethren over the issue of the national bank. Established by Alexander Hamilton in 1792 as a means of enabling America to quickly pay off its Revolutionary War debt and restore the value of its credit, Jackson in the South saw it largely as a crooked scheme that enriched a few bankers in the North, where most every banker lived, at the expense of the perpetually indebted landowners of the South. Further, there were many foreign investors, especially British investors in the bank, which as a result put many Americans directly in debt to foreign wealth. Seeing the bank both as a tool of the northern rich and elite, as well as an institution that had far too much of the nation's wealth invested in it, Jackson vetoed the bank's charter and withdrew all of the United States money stored in it, striking a critical blow at the national government's economic power. This move, however, proved to be economically disastrous, as shortly after his 2 terms as president ended in 1836, the nation quickly slumped into a massive depression that lasted well into the 1840s. One additional act, however, both enlarged the power of the national government while also illustrated a severe weakness within the checks and balances system, thereby weakening it. In the late 1820s, many settlers from Georgia had sought to expand into what the government recognized as Cherokee territory. Of course, it didn't hurt that gold had been discovered in their lands along the Tennessee River. In 1830, with Congress support, Jackson saw the Indian Removal Act pass, which would force the Cherokee off the land that had been theirs for centuries. Angered members of the tribe appealed to the Supreme Court over the legality of this act, which clearly violated treaties that George Washington himself had once signed with the Cherokee. In the 1832 case of Worcester versus Georgia, the Supreme Court sided with the Cherokee, claiming that they had the right to remain on their land, but Jackson refused to abide by the court's decision. Since Congress also supported the Cherokee's removal, the court was left with no one to side with, let alone enforce its decision. Jackson proceeded with the removal of the Cherokee tribe despite the fact that he was clearly violating the Constitution in refusing to recognize the court's ruling. Beginning in 1838, the Cherokee were forced that winter to march to their newly relocated home in Oklahoma. Known as the Trail of Tears, more than a quarter of the relocated tribe died from everything between starvation to freezing to even death from smallpox. It has since become one of the darker chapters in American history regarding how this country has chosen to treat its minority populations. Jackson's presidency from 1828 to 1836 became a bit of an enigma. At times he defended states' rights, such as with the Bank of the United States. Other times he sided with the national government, such as in the nullification crisis. One behavior remained constant, however. Jackson always sought to maintain a strong, powerful presidency through the process of making the other two branches of government weaker. Whether by directly defying orders from the Supreme Court or by continually threatening Congress with veto after veto over legislation he disliked, it's not hard to see how many hostile newspapers regarded him as King Andrew I, America's first monarch. Nonetheless, Jackson remained popular with Americans who saw him as their president, the leader, the voice, the speaker of the will of the people of America. Like his predecessors, Jackson too stepped down after 2 terms in office, deflating his image as a monarch, but not deflating his popularity. He threw his support behind the Democratic candidate in 1836, Martin Van Buren, who easily won, only to see his administration assailed by the economic woes ushered in by the absence of the Bank of the United States. The economy was in such turmoil that the Whig candidate John Tyler won in 1840, only to die a month after assuming office. Benjamin Harrison, his vice president, succeeded him, but lost to James K. Polk in 1844, again due largely to Andrew Jackson's support. With Jackson's subsequent death in 1845, the line of presidents who followed his policies came to an end when Polk left office in 1848. Jackson's influence, however, still remains in that both the Democrats and the Whigs worked harder and fought more fiercely between one another for votes in the popular election than their predecessors, the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, ever had. Strong presidents who court power and use the office of the president to its fullest extent are still compared to Jackson over 170 years later. Despite how little their personalities and policies resembled one another, Abraham Lincoln more than borrowed a page from Jackson's book about how to lead a nation when he led the troops into the bloodiest conflict in American history in order to restore the Union, end slavery, and forever cement the national government as the seat of power then, now, and for the foreseeable future to come.